Good afternoon. Welcome to the Let's continue with the seminar. Let's invite the mediator for this panel, Soviet Union and Brazil, Mr. Renato Rovai. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here once again, mediating this debate in an event organized by Boitempo in partnership with Sesc that has made available the equipment for the production of important events in the cultural field. So I would like to go straight to the point. I would like to invite those who really matter, because my role is actually vanishing from this panel. I would like to invite the panelist, Anita Prestes. Well, it's nice. We don't need to ask the round of applause, as you do it spontaneously. So, Anita, I'm going to read your mini bio. Anita was born in 1936 in the prison of women from Barnstrasse. I hope I have pronounced it correctly. In Nazi Germany, she's the daughter of Prestes and Olga Bernardo. I think you should know about that. She has a PhD in economics and philosophy from the Institute in Moscow and social history from the Federal University from Rio de Janeiro. She has written about the political action of Prestes and the history of communism in Brazil. She's a professor for the post-graduation program in history from the University of Rio and president of the Luiz Carlos Prestes Institute. Anita published Luiz Carlos Prestes, a communist in Brazil, by Boitempo. She won the Jabuti Award, and Olga Bernardo Prestes, communist in the archives of Gestapo. That's from 2017, and today she's going to be launching and autographing later 1917, the year that shattered the world, which is a collection of writings and has Anita's texts. And then I'll show the other books that she wrote during our panel here. I would like to invite Antonio Carlos Mazzeo, one of the commentators of this panel. Well, Mazzeo is a professor for the FEFELESH USP on history, and he works for the social services at the University of São Paulo. He published, among other books, O Estado, the State and Bourgeois in Brazil. He's also going to be autographing his book, The Origin of the Bourgeois, Autocracy, The Flight of Minerva, and Democracy in the Old Western World, and Sinfonia Acabada. The three of them were published by the publishing house Boitempo. And to complete the panel of the day, I would like to invite Luiz Bernardo. Has a degree in history by the George Washington University, has a PhD in economic history, and also he has a PhD in political science by the University of São Paulo. He has many articles published in many countries. He's the writer of Os Cangaceiros, Cansaço, A Longa Estação, and Caio Prado Júnior, the political biography, which is the most recent one, right? Okay. He will also be autographing his books after this panel. Well, all of the books that people want him to autograph, not only the last one. He won the award Ezequiel Martinez Estrada in 2014 because of his book Che Guevara and the Economic Debate in Cuba. He's a professor of contemporary history at the University of São Paulo, and he was chosen the Intellectual of the Year in 2016 by the Union of Brazilian Writers, and then he was awarded by the Juca Pato that was handed to many important Brazilian intellectuals. I'm going to talk about the arrangements. Well, Anita will open. She has 25 minutes. She produced a text specifically for this moment, and then the commentators will have between 10 to 13 minutes to render their remarks. And then we go back with Anita and we open for questions. Okay? So let's begin with Anita. Initially, I would like to thank the organizing committee for the invitation to participate in this event. It's a highly important event, such in a scenario that we are living today. The theme of my talk is going to be the Russian Revolution of October 1917 and the foundation of the Communist Party in Brazil. According to Rovai, the October Revolution produced the most formidable revolutionary movement in the modern history because it had deeper and global repercussions, much more than the French Revolution in 1789. If the ideas of the French lasted more than Bolshevism, according to Rovai, the practical consequences of 1917 were much greater and much more long-lasting than the ones that we saw in 1789. The English historian highlights that just 30 or 40 years after the arrival of Lenin in the Finland station in Petrograd, one-third of the humankind was living under regimes that resulted from the 10 days that shook the world and from the organizational model by Lenin, the Communist Party. Most followed the second wave of revolutions that emerged from the second phase of the long World War that Rovai dates, as many other historians, from 1914 to 1945. As of October 1917, a wave of revolutions spread out throughout the entire planet. And Rovai also writes that summarizing the October Revolution was universally acknowledged as an event that shattered the world. And the events in Russia inspired not only the revolutionaries, but also, more importantly, the revolutions, as well was the case of the German Revolution from 1918. Although the global revolution in which they invested, in which Lenin and Bolsheviks invested, did not materialize up until the beginning of the 20s, there was still hope in having such revolution. And the history of the 20th century, according to Robespierre, cannot be understood without the Russian Revolution and its direct and indirect effects. Latin America and Brazil, more specifically, were also affected by the repercussion of this major global event. In Brazil, since earlier in the 20th century, the workers' movement was influenced by the anarchy currents, anarchism and unionism, the most important ones. Under the leadership of such movements, the workers' unions in many of the most important Brazilian cities mobilized against the working conditions that were imposed on the workers by the employers, and they made major strikes. They held assemblies and meetings of workers, and they organized conferences and congresses, creating entities such as the federations and confederations that would represent their wishes. Well, the press also played a very important role in disseminating the ideas of the anarcho-union leaderships in struggling for the rights of the workers. The unions, led by the anarcho-unionists, they stood out in organizing public acts dedicated to May 1st, that is the Global Day for the Struggle of the Workers. So, from the sacrifice of the Chicago martyrs in 1886, the international traditions of the workers' movement were cultivated. As of 1915, after the beginning of the First World War, the workers' movement in Brazil mobilized in the struggle against the war and for peace. By fighting war and by invoking nationalism and patriotism to fight against the bourgeois fights, as the anarchy press would say, the press would write, "We have no nation because we have no right to living in society." Delegates and union associations and representatives of workers' newspapers, in a meeting held in 1915, created a popular commission as a movement against the war. In the very same year, a conference for peace was organized, and according to Astrogildo Pereira, who later founded the Communist Party in Brazil, in spite of the weaknesses in organizing, it was a milestone, a relevant milestone that marked the defined position to fight against imperialism and for peace and freedom. Other manifestations took place in many areas in Brazil, really acknowledging the position of refrain to war and defense to global peace from the workers' movement in Brazil, led by the anarcho-unionists. From 17 to 20, in Brazil, we had the uprising of the workers' struggles under the leaderships that I mentioned. Two moments were remarkable in that sense. The strike from 1917 in São Paulo. There is a book that was published by Luiz on that topic. And the uprising of 1918 in Rio de Janeiro, suffocated with violence early on because of the action of the police force. According to Carlos Augusto, a researcher from the uprising of 1918, it was the first organized attempt held by the sectors of the workers' movement in Brazil to promote a social revolution that was wished by the anarchists. Likewise, Joan Foster Dulles highlights that the leaderships of the movements were willing to repeat the Russian events because they believed that the social revolution that began in Russia would spread out all around the world inevitably. Undeniably, the Russian Revolution was a repercussion vis-à-vis the workers' movement in Brazil. The Red Year that was published because of the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution is quite revealing because it shows a careful selection of documents from that time, more specifically the anarchist press from those years. The first volume from 1980 from the anarchy newspaper, O Cosmopolita, recorded that in 1917, full of hope, the suburb Russian Revolution begins, opening to the peoples the door of claims. magnificent. Then we see 1918 emerging, bringing with it the most beautiful promises of emancipation to the pioneers of the new era, to the workers of this idea in March, our total commotion under the ages of anarchy. The very same newspaper published an article by Astrogido Pereira called Claim to Anarchists. He asserted that the revolution is knocking at our door. It's our duty to be on guard, ready to everything that might come. And somebody perhaps should close his or her eyes, that he or she won't see what happens around the world, that is not seeing the Russian Revolution. Astrogido Pereira called the Russian Revolution as economic in its origins and ends, liberating in its means and processes and in its direction. And it came to teach the revolutionaries and the peoples of all nations the only modern formula that is efficiently destructive, capable of causing a social and deep transformation. That's what Pereira wrote. According to the anarcho-unionists' leaderships in Brazil, the Russian Revolution was anti-capitalistic from the economic point of view and liberating from the point of view of the means that were used. So it fell under the anarchy framework that are against the conquer of the political power by the workers. According to this perspective, supported to Pereira, in Russia they followed an anarchy program that would synthesize many popular aspirations. In March 1919, in the capital city, anarchy leaderships like Astrogido Pereira and José Oiticica founded a party that was called the Communist Party of Brazil, whose first circular oriented to the workers' organizations throughout Brazil would say, in view of the enthusiasm that we see in the working class and in the overall people because of the movements that we witness in this world that pends toward a social transformation that are broadly based on the communist ideas, the workers in Rio decided to found the Communist Party in Brazil. For the founders of the Communist Party, acknowledging the communist ideas as the guideline of the revolutionary process in Russia was not contradictory to their convictions to liberty, that is, anarchy convictions. Researcher Fabiana Rogério Machon highlights that according to the leaders of the Communist Party, the Russian Communist Party is accountable for the social transformations that the anarcho-unionists aim at. So nothing more fair than following the Russian strides in founding a communist party, adding that it's explicit the influence of the Russian evolution on the workers' movement. The PCB recently adopted a discourse full of ideas of communism. Its operation was following the anarchic unionist principles such as the refusal of taking on the political power and the extinction of state. Fabiana Marçon highlights that in that moment there was no theoretical basis to understand that the Russian Revolution and its direction and the Russian Communist Party, they were all based in Marxism and not in anarchism, as the leaders thought. Years later, Astrogido Pereira highlighted that it was an organization that was typically anarchist, and the name of Communist Party was a pure reflex in the workers' community of the powerful influence made by the proletariat revolution in Russia that was led by the communists of Russia. What they didn't know, Astrogido continues, what they didn't know for sure is that the communists that were leading the Russian revolutions, they were actually Marxists and not anarchists. Only later did the differences were clarified, producing thereby the rupture between the anarchists or the pure anarchists. They are inflexible, and then they became criticizing the Russian communists, and finally they fought against the Soviet Union and the anarchists that remained loyal to the workers' class. And finally, they would eventually understood that in Marxism, this is where we find the fair theoretical definition for the ideology of the proletariat. Astrogido years later wrote about that. The new party developed intense activities, and we highlighted the organization of the march in May 1st, 1919, considered by João Duis the 1st of May that was the most brilliant one in Brazil. The newspaper A Razão estimated that there were 60,000 people. That was the number of people in the march held in Rio de Janeiro. In 1919, that happened. The year of 1919 was marked by the crisis of the post-war, and there were new workers' strikes as well as major struggles, and police repression was increasingly more violent. As of the year 20s, with the unruled repression against the workers and their entities, against the repression by the authorities, they were engaged in preventing the organization of the workers' movement. So the workers' movement had a decrease after that. The crisis that began in the anarcho-syndicalist sector was part of it. And then we saw the true face of the Russian Revolution, a revolution that was led by the Marxists' conceptions that were opposing to the theories of anarchism such as Kropotkin. As Astrogido Pereira wrote, the anarchists that remained loyal to the workers' class, they truly understand that Marxism was the fair theoretical definition of the ideology of the proletariat. They were the ones that sank in 1922. They founded the true Communist Party in Brazil, PCB. It was founded in March 1922. On that occasion, they held their first conference with 9 delegates representing a total of 73 members throughout the country. Its weakness was shown not only in the limited number of members, but also in its ideological and political inconsistency. The cultural delay in Brazil, resulting from its historical formation, slave-based empires and the owners of slaves and land could defeat all of the attempts of a popular uprising and prevent the advancement of any kind of organization from the popular sectors. So this became a strong hurdle to the development of a workers' movement under the aegis of the socialist, Marxists, and revolutionary ideas. In neighboring countries such as Argentina and Chile, and by the end of the 19th centuries, we had socialist parties. They were under the influence of the reformist trends that prevailed in the European socialist movement at the time. They contributed for organizing the workers' movements in their countries and disseminating the Marxist thinking. Although this was marked by reformism by Bernstein, we should highlight the prestige of the Democratic Socialist Party in Germany. The success of the party should be acknowledged. An influence that would also have a repercussion in Brazil with the creation of some socialist parties, whose existence was never consolidated. In this country, there was no conditions for the workers to achieve success by means of the parliamentary struggle, because the National Congress that was controlled by the agricultural oligarchies that led this country with an iron hand, they were insensitive to any pressure coming from the workers' movements. For that very reason, the unionism in Brazil would only advance under the influence of workers that came from Southern Europe, that migrated especially to São Paulo, but also to Rio de Janeiro and other points in this country. And then we would like to highlight those who supported the anarchists' currents.
And others, with the leadership of a workers' movement in the European continent. In Brazil, their proposal, through the unions organizing strikes and having as the objective the so-called direct action, without political parties and condemning the fight for the political power, clearly distinguished itself from the defending currents of Marx's ideas. On the other hand, this orientation was capable of attracting considerable sectors of the workers who were insensitive to appeals of socialist parties who had limited presence in the national scenario. The PCB's frailty was evident since its foundation. Its first Congress did not even discuss a program for the new entity, limiting itself to approve the 21 conditions of admission in the Third International Communist created in 1919 by Lenin in opposition to the Second International, which leaders had supported the bourgeois governments during the First World War. The main concern of the delegates of the First Congress of PCB was to obtain their admission in the International Communist and at the same time participating to the movement of helping the people who lived in the Volga region, who underwent a big drought. The Brazilian workers' movement did not have any Marxist tradition. This reason explained the theoretical insufficiencies for the orientation, for the guidance of the party. The Second Congress of the PCB was held a year later, and theses about the political situation were approved, the national one, based on the dualist conception of agrarism and industrialism, which dominated in the direction of the party, according to Astrogildo Pereira. Agrarism or Industrialism book, recently produced by Otávio Brandão, another guidance of the party. Astrogildo recognized that this was the first attempt of Marxist analysis of the national situation. And this was a fight between the semi-feudal agrarian capitalism and the modern capitalism as being the fundamental contradiction of the Brazilian society post-republic. According to his very short but consistent analysis, Astrogildo continued, departing from these conceptions, which resulted of a mechanical and arbitrary analysis of the Brazilian situation, the movements that in 1922 and 24, the movements that arose from there, they are better put in apart from the real political situation. As of the analysis made by Otávio Brandão, the referred book was reached a conclusion, which was included in the thesis of the PCB, that the imperialism, English imperialism, would support the agrarianism, and the American imperialism would support the industrialism. And PCB would approach the tendencies, in fact, the expression of the revolutionary bourgeoisie for the third tenantist revolution, trying for a hegemony of the proletariat, which it would be the agrarian oligarchy together with the financial one. According to PCB, the reflection of the Marxist thinking in Brazil of that time was fair to try an alliance with the tenantist alliances, mainly with Luiz Carlos Prestes, since during the 1920s, the tenantism was a leadership of the opposition powers to the power of the agrarian oligarchies that governed the country. In the 20s, the small PCB faced the repression of the oligarchic governments, which led it to be clandestine for the majority of its time. On the other hand, a fight with the anarcho-unionists, among which the professor Oiticica. Since it was in decline, in the international plan, it was persistently fighting with the Soviet experience.
and their enemies, and he reached important. The lack of theoretical guidance from PCB contributed to the fact that the party was not able to resist the imposition of the dogmatic impositions approved from the Sixth International Congress held in 1928 and confirmed in the first conference of the Latin American communist countries that was held in Buenos Aires in 1929. The third Congress from the PCB that was held in 1928 and early 1929, we still saw the guidance of establishing alliances, engaging to conquer the hegemony of the proletariat against the oligarchy, especially against the English imperialism, as they called it at the time. In the third Congress by PCB, held a few months later in October 1929, the direction of PCB fell in view of the determinations of international communists. So they adopted the policy of class against class. They rejected any kind of alliance with the bourgeois or small bourgeois sector. According to the model approved by international communists, by the colonial and semi-colonial countries, among them Brazil, and then they started considering that there would be a revolutionary situation in the country.
And the policy of the communists would be the immediate preparation of the democratic bourgeois of the revolution, characterized as agrarian and anti-imperialist, with the establishment of peasant and workers' movement based on the same which existed in Russia. It was a very an orientation which was disconnected from the Brazilian reality and which led PCB to successive defeats. The weak assimilation of the Marxist theory, this was the reflection of how Brazil was not so well developed. The only model existent was the Russian Revolution, and its repercussion provoked in the revolutionaries the wish to repeat this experience. Astrogildo Pereira would recognize this later. We did not understand the exact sense of the truth according to which, without a revolutionary theory, there cannot be a revolutionary action. Revolutionary theory meant for us, Astrogildo writes, to apply mechanically, freely, the political line and the revolutionary experience of other peoples. PCB, following the orientation of the Sixth Congress of the International Communists, applying mechanically the teachings coming from the model of the Russian Revolution to Brazil, was a dogmatic application about Tsarist Russian and the character of revolution in that country. In a text I published in 1980, I meant that theses by Lenin were transposed without any critics to the Brazilian reality existing in 1920-1930. The leader of the Russian Revolution wrote, "In countries such as Russia, the workers' class suffers less from the consequence of capitalism, but due to the lack of development of the country. That's why the workers' class is interested in a faster development of capitalism. The bourgeois revolution is exactly the revolution that more decidedly takes away the reminiscences of feudalism and guarantees in a more complete way the faster development of capitalism. At the same time, Lenin showed that under the conditions of Russia, under the imperialism, the revolution would be coward. The Russian Revolution would have to ally workers and peasants. And that's why there is the need for the proletariat to reach hegemony in the revolutionary process to assure that it continues towards the revolution. This was written by Lenin in the beginning of the 20th century. In the Brazilian case, since in those years there were no research about a national reality, the concrete analysis of the capitalist development was insufficient. Copying Lenin's situation to a completely different situation induced PCB to identify a supposed feudalism in the field, which together with imperialism would be a difficulty for the capitalism. While capitalism found new ways of progressing depending on imperialism and maintaining some types of production which were non-capitalist, the communists considered that it would be necessary for a revolution equal to the bourgeois revolution under the hegemony of the workers' class to advance, to assure the success of a first step of a socialist revolution. So it was a step-by-step character for the revolution. For the countries called colonial and semi-colonial, the strategy of the revolution was divided into the first democratic bourgeois and the second socialist. This scheme was kept for decades in the history of PCB. In the practice, PCB became a national liberating party, actively participating for all the fair causes of the Brazilian peoples, but without being able to conduct the socialist revolution in Brazil. The false vision contained a content of the right searching for, in fact, to develop the capitalism. In the Tsarist Russia, developing capitalism was a progressist task, as Lenin showed. In Brazil, the bourgeois revolution, which was possible under the historical conditions, happened in a different condition, as the sociologist Florestan Fernandes revealed. In the Brazilian case, for the communists, it would be necessary to disrupt with an advance towards the socialist revolution. A wrong strategy would have a consequence, the adoption of tactics that would be wrong as well, with contradictory actions. In the absence of concrete analysis of the Brazilian bourgeoisie, of its different sectors and political positions, PCB used the thesis of the existence of a supposedly national bourgeoisie, which was imported from other countries, which would be following the interests of the imperialism, or else could be also considered a revolutionary force. And this influenced the alliances, and it would be a hindrance to the political practices of the communists. The national issue was present in the intellectual debate. Many authors wrote about this. And in the crisis moments, it would synthesize the others, contributing that the nationalism would become an inclusive concept. I don't have time to mention the authors. The same way, it is possible to affirm that the construction of the nationalism became one of the fundamental concerns of the intellectuals in Brazil. During the First War, in the words of Pecot, nationalism invaded the Brazilian culture. And according to Renato Ortiz, the emergence of a nationalist spirit came about, which would fight the ideas of the old republic. So the new ideas of PCB would have fruits in Brazil thanks to its acceptance by broad social sectors influenced by the nationalist thinking. If the thesis defended by the communists found repercussion with several sectors of the Brazilian society, this was due greatly to the circumstances of such positions to tend to converge with the nationalist feelings broadly diffused in the civil society of the country, among which we can highlight the concern with the guarantee of the Brazilian sovereignty. So the policy of PCB did not consist in a reflection of supposed impositions of the internationalist communist or the internationalist communist movement, as frequently told. As I tried to show before, due to the adverse conditions of PCB, when PCB were founded without a workers' movement with Marxist traditions and the lack of development in the country, so there would be the need for a communist party in Brazil. But the weak presence of Marxism at the intellectuals, together with the nationalist thinking, contributed decisively for PCB to become a party, national liberating party. As Eric Robsbaum adverted, the real danger for the Marxists is to accept the nationalism as an ideology and program instead of facing it realistically as a fact, a condition of their fight as socialists. Well, you might have noticed that it is a text full of issues to be discussed, right? It is not a text, a traditional text. So raising questions, raising issues which are very significant. My objective is to contribute to discuss the traditions of the workers' movement in Brazil, the traditions of the communist movement in Brazil, and to contribute so that new pathways are found to transform Brazilian society to a revolutionary path towards the socialism, which I am convinced is the only way out to reach social justice, fairness, and democracy for all Brazilians. Thank you. Thank you, Anita. So I now first call Mazzeo. We have, I was told 15. So, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank for the invitation and congratulate this initiative from Editora Boitempo for us to reflect upon Brazil. And this is a very deep reflection about the meaning and importance of the 100 years of Russian Revolution. I also want to share this panel with friends, getting to know Rovai today, Anita and Pericás, and with all the audience for us to exchange our opinions. Técnico, por favor, abaixa mais. I agree very much with what Anita says. This reflection from Anita expresses a situation about the process of construction of a communist party, revolutionary parties, and all the odds that the revolutionary movement have gone through. I would start making an observation in Anita's words And it was very important how she showed how the Communist the party was built, PCB, in the sense that there was a previous movement, which is the anarchist, which is the workers and proletarian movement. It's important to highlight. When I have only 5 more minutes, please tell me. And telling that this small movement, which was concentrated in some cities in Brazil, had a central role. What was the first one? This movement, despite us telling that it is incipient, full of problems, it arrives to Brazil and Latin America with a socialist project which is very little outlined, theoretically confused, very but there is a problem that it poses in Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, and Peru. But mainly Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, where there was a big influence of the anarcho-unionism, is that this movement puts forth for the first time 2 questions. First, the presence of the workers, the proletariats, in the national life of these countries, mainly like in countries like Brazil, where the bourgeoisie has an autocratic tradition, a slavist tradition. So this movement says, as it puts forth, a posture of radicality, which the anarchist movement puts forth, is fundamental because it is subversive, absolutely subversive, in a society in which the presence of the worker is an offense to the upper classes. The second is that this movement, with all its problems, generates highly important intellectuals. Besides Astrogildo Pereira, also Edgar Loenro, Oiticica. Loenro in São Paulo is one of the leaders of the strike of 17, which, despite being at the same time the apex of the anarchist movement, it is the moment of its crisis and dissolution. In São Paulo, the strike of 17 is fundamental, since it not only shows how central workers are. So the guys who commanded the strike in 17, and this is also celebrating its 100th anniversary, this strike is a milestone in a qualitative leap of the workers' movement, despite being defeated, although it was a victory at the same time. 8 hours of working, the right for pregnant women, against the expiration of underage, and so many things. These conquests of the workers were achieved in a brutal strike of 3 very difficult months with a violent repression by the today's military police. They are proud of having repressed the strike of 1970. You can look it up in the website. Canudos as well, and everything that they could repress and support the dictatorship's coup d'etat in 1964. By that time, the employers were obliged to sign a series of reivindications. So, but they, after all, they incarcerated these 3 leaders, but they did not follow everything they signed. We have Astrogildo, we have Otávio Brandão, who are original in their reflections. Original because they will think the national issues as of the national's reality. And the frailty that Anita pointed out of the Brazilian Marxism and Latin American as a whole, I would say. But it is out of discussion that the reflections of Astrogildo, putting forth the importance of Machado de Assis in his literary critique and the reflection through art, the Brazilian reality, in the effort of Otávio Brandão of making a Leninism-Marxism treaty, according to him, about the Brazilian reality, demonstrates that this movement, although incipient, generates a huge qualitative leap, which culminates with the foundation of PCB in 1922. But obviously, the foundation of PCB, I would say, foundation of PCB, the arrival of Astrogildo to the General Secretariat of the party, because there was a time when Abílio Genechetti was the General Secretary, but he was unable to accomplish the importance of his duty. He could not bear not even the first repression. So the arrival of Astrogildo was another leap of quality in the organization. Astrogildo is doing this in the anarchist press. He was fighting this battle. And when Astrogildo takes over the secretariat of the party, was to create a newspaper and a cultural magazine. This is very important. Second thing is also a conference, first conference of the party using the thesis, the effort, the reflective effort of Otávio Brandão. It was not only his, but this was something that was being produced collectively. And this was from the first party's theoretical framework, so to say. So the constitution of the party, although starting small, and it enrooted itself among the intellectuals, the avant-garde among the workers, so it was able to provoke a leap in quality in the Marxist production. Obviously, it received the influence of the international Marxist movements, with all the effort of PCB, and with also in Peru, and which they made from the original understanding of their reality. They ended up with the period of Bolshevization. So between 28 and 29, the Bolshevization period, which the International calls so, but it is the framing towards an analysis which is much more connected to the ideal type of revolution than to a dialectic understanding of a revolutionary process of the capitalist countries of the world. And this has a consequence in Latin America, which is the intervention of the communist parties, the exit of Astrogildo from the General Secretariat of PCB, the exit of, putting aside Mariado in Peru, and so on. There was a moment of going backwards.
So there were some leaps with a theoretical reductionism, I would say, and also with the broadening of the interpretation, as Anita mentioned, the feudalism in Brazil and in Latin America. The feudalism issue is not only the smuggling of international communists in analyzing the Latin American realities. It has to do with the tradition of the Iberic historiography. If you take Venex Sodelli, he said, I didn't invent feudalism in Brazil. This discussion was going on in Brazil, and the international communist says, well, there's feudalism in Brazil. Oh, great, so I'm right, he said. It's not something that is totally strange to the theoretical formulation of the Iberic historiography, and more specifically the Portuguese historiography in Brazil. Finding feudalism in a country that is colonized because of mercantilism is complicated. But since you have feudalism and the bourgeois, you create a scenario, imaginary scenario, that's a reproduction of these models that are imposed top-down by the international communists, by the Sixth Congress, whereby it's clear it's a Weberian analysis of the global revolution. Okay, 11 minutes. I'm about to conclude. So this eventually will generate a mistaken interpretation of the political action. Anita drew the attention to that. Revolutionary theory and revolution. If you have a wrong theory, you have a wrong action. This is clear, right? And it's not only about PCB, the communist parties in Latin America. They establish alliances with the worst oligarchies, with the worst industrial sectors, because they were not national at all. If somebody had a delusionment of having a national bourgeoisie in Brazil, the first defeat was actually in 1964, and the second is now, the one that we are living, the largest attack against the Brazilian nation since the liberal revolution from 1820. They wanted to recolonize Brazil. So actually this mistake will lead to mistaken alliances, wrong alliances. The workers' class will take on the project of the bourgeois and not the project of the proletariat. And this leads to defeat and also a political line of tagging along to the bourgeois project that is being subordinate to imperialism in that case, on the one hand. On the other hand, it leads to reactions. For example, desperate reactions. We had a defeat in 1964 generating guerrilla, and guerrilla is a desperate action. It's heroic. Of course, we have to pay tribute to those who die in guerrillas, but it's totally wrong because we lost people, important people in the guerrilla. And why? Because there was a misinterpretation, a misunderstanding. The Araguaia guerrilla wanted to, cover the rural side of Brazil because they thought Brazil was agricultural, but in the 70s, Brazil was industrialized. This shows the mistakes of reformism on one side and the mistakes of the idealistic posture or stance of the armed struggle. And closing, I would like to say the national liberalism, well, even the guerrilla couldn't achieve that, because we still had the issue of national liberation as the core, even the core of political revolutionary groups such as VPR, for example, the PCdoB with the guerrilla, for example, and PCB, of course, the entire time was addressing this issue as a possibility of having an autonomous national capitalism to promote a democratic bourgeois revolution. The worst of all is that the political line that is defeated in 1964 is reproduced after the 80s by PT, the Labour Party, which once again does that, but with a different element. For those who are my age, there was a remedy for a headache. There was melhoral. So PT, the Labour Party, took a pioral that is worsening, a worsening remedy. PCB said that an alliance should be established with the national bourgeois to be able to promote a democratic bourgeois revolution, to set in the order of the day the socialistic revolution. The PCB said that the alliance was tactical and the strategy would be the revolutionary process for the socialists and the proletariat. The PT liked it, but they removed socialists. They just made an alliance with the national bourgeois. They forgot about the socialism in this alliance, and the PT is the Labour Party. Thank you. Okay, 15 minutes sharp. So now, Pericás, you have 15 minutes. Are you Menshevik or Bolshevik, Pericás? Hello. Sound like a singer, don't I? But I'll try to be briefer than my comrade Mazzeo. First, I would like to thank Boitempo, the publishing company. I would like to thank Sesc, Professor Anita Prestes, Professor Antônio Carlos Mazzeo, my great friend for many years, Mr. Renato Rovai, and all of you who are here with us today. First, I would like to remind you that not only are we celebrating the centenary of the Russian Revolution, but also the 50 years of the assassination of Che Guevara in Bolivia. It's a very important date that was kind of neglected this year. We have not seen the same mobilization to discuss that moment. And the two major moments, watershed moments, I would say, for the development of Marxism in Latin America in the 20th century are, on the one hand, the Russian Revolution in 1917, and then the subsequent development of the Internal Committee in 1919, and then the Cuban Revolution that took place in Cuba in January 1959. So remembering Guevara here is very much important. We always have to mention Che Guevara. We have to mention the Russian Revolution and Che Guevara's trajectory. This should be inspiring for us today. And events like this should be seen as a fora to debate the moment that we are living as well. That is the situation of Brazil and the world today. Just to remind you, next year we'll be celebrating 90 years of the birth of Che Guevara. So perhaps next year we'll have something done for him. It's important to address this theme, and I'll try to comment on some moments of Anita's talk, some excerpts of her talk, and also talk about some Mazzeo's excerpts. During decades, the left wing was discussing the Brazilian Revolution, or at least the paths for the development and sovereignty of Brazil. And these discussions begin with great strength on the left wing, especially in the 1920s, under the aegis of the October Revolution and Leninism. The first emblematic attempt, the theoretical attempt to understand our reality. That was the first one, in spite of all of the problems and limitations that we are aware of. Otávio Brandão's book, Agrarism, Leninist and Marxist essay about the rebellion in São Paulo and the class war in Brazil from halfway through the 1920s. So if we think about that period as well as after periods, we can think about Leôncio Basbaum when he wrote in the 30s In the Way of the Peasant and Workers' Revolution, and then the Brazilian Path to Development. Nelson Werneck Sodré Muniz Bandeira when he writes about the path for the Brazilian Revolution, Caio Prado Jr. with a wide diversity of works. And the Brazilian Revolution will crown all of that. Carlos Marighella, Rui Mauro Marini, that is, all of these people throughout decades, they have been concerned in building a political, theoretical, and interpretative project on this country, inspired by the Bolshevik experience and by Leninism as well, because we have been talking about Marxism. The Marxists would incorporate Leninism, right? And I believe now it is time we rethought the pathways for change in Brazil. There is a major production of papers, essays and papers, and even books about this moment that we are living. And I believe that we have to build more than scenario discussions. We have to understand which are the variables in the historical process that repeatedly presents some variables that I would say are quite insidious. And I would like to see a more deep and more serious discussion at this point in time, more specifically. But talking about the Russian Revolution and its influence in Brazil, we thought, what was the impact? What was the repercussion in Brazil, both from the February Revolution and the October Revolution? So what did we know about Russia and the political events of 1917? How did the events were brought by the press to Brazil and throughout Latin America? If we take the press, the mainstream press in Peru, in Cuba, in Brazil, in Mexico, we'll realize there are many similarities, because the February Revolution will be broadly disseminated in Latin America in a favorable fashion, I would say. But much of what is written about the February Revolution and then after about the October Revolution, these were materials that were filtered from the international agencies: United Press, Associated Press, Corriere della Sierra, Messaggero, Havas. And these were articles that were very unfavorable. They were criticizing Bolsheviks during the year of 1917 and also after the revolution. They are described in articles in the mainstream press, Lenin and the Bolsheviks as socialist extremists, agents of German, spies at the service of Kaiser. So there is this strong attack of the mainstream bourgeois press against Lenin and the Bolsheviks. At the same time, there's this ideological dispute, political and ideological dispute of the progressist sectors. Some elements of the working movements are quite different, especially in Latin America. Intellectuals, leaderships, militants, they will position themselves favoring Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and they write in the press for the workers at the time. And it's a counter-opposition. So who are these people? The most important one is Carlos Balino from Cuba, which is perhaps one of the pioneers of Marxism in Latin America. And he writes about Russia since 1905 and 1906, and he keeps on writing after the events in 1917. He's one of the founders of the Cuban Communist Party, together with Julio Antonio Meras, who also writes about the Soviet Russia. Astrovaldo Pereira as well. So in Latin America, you have many of these people who are working on this theme and counterposing the bourgeois press. So we have been talking about an ideological narrative dispute, and it's also a dispute for political positioning. There was an anarchist press, and later on a press connected to the communists. And Astrogido, as Mazzeo said, is a fundamental person. So they discuss here in Brazil the Russian Revolution. Sometimes they support the newspapers, and some anarchists later on, and in Cuba it's clear, they are against the revolution. And this really shows a critical positioning to that revolution. But we have Spartacus, Voz do Povo, A Plebe, Avante, Vanguarda, all outlets, the Communist Party, the working class, a whole diversity of publications that will try and handle that. And they publish texts coming from abroad and also texts produced by the Brazilian militants. Well, the dispute will also take place in the editorial arena. So we have the publication of critical books unfavorable to the Soviet experience, and the market will be full of these books. And on the other hand, we have translation of foreign works or texts written by Brazilian travelers. They travel to the Soviet Union and try to depict the country in a favorable way. Think about titles. Just by the titles, you can see the opponents of the works that were published, especially in the 30s. The Russian Hell, or Inferno Russo, Bolshevism from the inside, in the country of the Soviets, the secret forces of the revolution. These are the titles of the book, Moscow Without a Mask. And at the same time, we have the 10 Days That Shook the World by Reed, and New Russia, Impressions of Moscow by Diego Hidalgo. And if you have the edition from Mariátegui with a text about the Russian Revolution, you will see that these very books that are read here, they were read by him, by people in Peru, and they were circulating in other countries as well. Russia in 1931 by Sérgio Mazzeo, 120 million by Michael Gold, Aspects of the Soviet Education. These are all titles of books. So you have the foreign production happening here in Brazil and books from Brazilian travelers. And it's really a phenomenon. Not much was known about what was going on in Russia. And then both the Soviet Russia and the Soviet Union that emerged later on, of course, it becomes a mystery to most of the key audiences. So we have travelers from the American continent. If we think about the United States, journalists, Boris Weinstein, Goldberg, Williams, John Reed, Louise Bryans. She was the wife of John Reed. So you have a large amount of intellectuals and journalists and militants that are going to Soviet Union to see closely what's happening. And Brazilians who do that as well. So you have this production of Brazilian travelers. We have this book, Russia, by Maurício Medeiros in 1932. A Brazilian Engineer in Russia by Cláudio Edmundo from 1933. Where is the Proletariat by César? URSS, The New World by Caio Jr., based on the trip that he made in 1933. He publishes in 34. There's a second edition in 35. Then it is confiscated by the police, and never again has it had a third edition. Okay, 11 minutes. Okay, 4 more minutes. And then many other books. Well, in addition to the mandatory reading of the militants, Lenin's work, for example, Bukharin, not only part of that, it's translated into Portuguese. While it's not translated, yes, we can read the rest that has been brought here. In addition to the diffusion of ideas, in addition to this editorial journalistic aspect, we have to think about the construction of political organizations that will support or that will be connected to the Soviet Union. Para-party organizations. We are talking about the committee that will support the refugees from Russia from January 21. Astro Pereira was the secretary of that organization. We are talking about the International Red Cross that starts operating in Brazil on the 23rd, 24th, the creation of the International Co-op of Workers, known as the Society for Mutual Help, created by Caio Prado Jr., Carlos Prado, and Tito Battini, the Society of the Friends of Soviet Union. So we have connections of Brazilian organizations, the Association of Brazilian Geographists with Volkswagen, that is a relationship with a foreign country, and cultural organizations that will publicize Soviet Union. The Club of the Modern Artists, created in 1932, is an example of that, and it will promote many talks and events and exhibitions, upholding and promoting major events, talking about and publicizing what's happening in the Soviet Union. Jaime Ador da Câmara, Tarsila do Amaral, Oswaldo César, West's History, Flávio de Carvalho, and perhaps the talk that was the most successful in the early 30s was the talk by Caio Prado Jr. about the Soviet Union and his trip to there, that would originate the book later on. And then the organizations themselves that support the Soviet Union and the parties. The first Communist Party in Brazil that was anarchist from 1919, that lasted very short period of time, and PCB from 1922. And that would be a quite interesting and long discussion for another moment, but we should really show how all of these parties are built under the ages of Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution. But on the other hand, they're built with the history of the proletariat struggles in each of the countries. So there'll be a quite interesting difference between the countries. A socialistic party in Peru, which is Andean, and it has a tradition, it will try to emulate a central committee which is similar to the indigenous one. So they bring the Peruvian experience to building that party. And in Cuba, there's a whole different story. We have the union movement, the tobacco sellers, Carlos Balinha with the students' movement that was revolutionary, Juan Antonio Meira with the organizations, Agrupación Socialista, Agrupación Comunista de Havana. In Mexico, there are two parties with a high level of penetration of foreigners. In the United States, when two communist parties emerge as well, and we have the participation of immigrants, which is quite strong. And in Argentina with PSI, and then it will be turned into PCA. The three first parties of the continent are from the US, from Argentina, and from Mexico. And finally, and I'll close, unfortunately I have to close, because there would be a lot to say. In addition to the travelers that go and observe and write and publicize in the press or in books what's happening in the Soviet Union, and they're building these organizations because these travelers, many of them incorporate themselves to the Communist Party, or they were members of the Communist Party. So we do have Brazilians that go live in the Soviet Union. They want to see it closely. They want to be able to work within that experience. So we have different cases. For example, there are some cases of Brazilians that go to the Soviet Union as exilees, and eventually they work in a diversity of activities. Otávio Brandão is one of them. From 1931 to 1946, he stays there. He is arrested and deported. And eventually he goes with his wife and daughters there, and he lives there for many years. Others are sent by the PCB to study in international Leninist schools. Heitor Ferreira Lima is an example of that. He spends 3 years in the Soviet Union studying, and according to him, it was a major moment for intellectual, political, ideological growth. He really praises what he learned there, and he spends 3 years as of 27. And Claudio Endibundo, who was an engineer, an urbanist, so he's hired to stay there 6 years. He's going to work there as an architect and urbanist by the National Supreme Council for National Economy there in Russia. So we have Jacob Bazayan as well. They come back after 16 years in the Soviet Union. They come back to Brazil, and they become anti-communists, anti-Soviets. A classical case that I'm not going to mention because somebody speaks better than I do. That's the case of Prestes. And Anita herself can tell us the experience of Prestes himself and her experience in regards to the Soviet Union, their personal relationships, and how life happened in that country. The themes are very rich. There is a huge amount of streams that we could explore here. Anyhow, my time's up, and I truly appreciate your patience. Thank you very much. I'm just the agent of KGB here. That's who I am. The direction of KGB will define the time slots. Anita, you have 10 minutes now, and then we'll have 20 or 30 minutes for the Q&A. Based on the questions, the many questions from the audience. So, Anita. Oh, well, once again, I would like to thank the organizing committee, especially Ivana Zinki and the guys from Boitempo and Sesc, for the perfect organization of this event and for the invitation that was made to me to participate in this event. In this debate that we're having here, I see two aspects that are deeply intertwined. And we could say that they are two facets of the same coin. On the one hand, we have all of the important aspects, the positive aspects, I would say, of the repercussion of the Russian Revolution in a country like Brazil, not to say Latin America, but we are here limiting ourselves to Brazil. At least that's what I do. That is the importance of the happenings, especially the October Revolution, I would say, which was a proletariat revolution in Russia, and the influence that it plays in a country that has a cultural delay, a cultural gap that is dominated by agrarian oligarchies. Well, the country had just left 4 centuries of slavery. There was this whole environment that was not appropriate to create a communist party. And this is how the Communist Party is created, as a fruit of this influence from the Russian Revolution. So it was an overwhelming influence. And Robsbaum, not by random, calls it as the beginning of the 20th century, the First World War and the Russian Revolution. It was a remarkable event. And it's not only remarkable for the 20th century, it's remarkable in the history of humankind, because for the first time, the explored ones, the proletariat, not only do they take over power, they abolish the private property and the exploration of men by men, and they're able to be kept in power. They're able to keep themselves in power. In the Communa in Paris, this was not attainable. They took over the power, but they lasted for 70 days only. So it is really a transformation in the history of humankind, and this is deeply important. Likewise, I usually say that the importance and the repercussion of the Russian Revolution for the world in 1917, well, here in Latin America, it could be compared to the Cuban Revolution. That is the Cuban Revolution from 1959, which was turned into a socialistic revolution as well. For Latin America, it is just like the Russian Revolution is for the global scenario. So I would like to stress that and show the different aspects of the influence. First, in the working movement, as I mentioned, but also an influence on the intellectuals, on many sectors, and on the life of the country. It's fundamental to show all of that, I think. But I also believe that if we have a perspective of today, thinking on how to advance towards a socialist revolution, on how to advance towards deep transformations of the Brazilian society that will really lead us to socialism. I think that the experience in Brazil and in other countries showed that there is no use trying to reform capitalism. The reform of capitalism, or building a good, perfect capitalism, or an improved capitalism, I would say this doesn't work. In Europe, we had the example of the welfare, and we see the failure of the welfare state. We're not going to have good capitalism, especially in these days. The only solution is socialism, and in order to promote socialism, the global experience is theoretical, and we also have a practical experience that revealed that without overthrowing, without revolution, without building a new state machine, that won't work.
So if we have this perspective, it's important that when we analyze the repercussion of the Russian Revolution in Brazil, in particular in the creation and in the existence of the Communist Party, which during decades the PCB, Brazilian Communist Party, had an important role in this country, analyze what really went wrong, which is not very pleasant to be approached, mainly for those who were a long time active in the party. I myself was active in the party, and I think it is important to face critically. So you might have seen that my text today, which is reproduced in this book that Boitempo just published, this text of mine is polemic, with polemic thesis, where I affirm, as you heard, that basically PCB was unable to transform itself into a communist party. It was National Liberating Party, very meritory, participated in all fights against imperialism in Brazil, but was unable to become a party which would conduct the proletariat and the working masses in Brazil towards the socialist revolution. So we must ask ourselves why and what to do to overcome these difficulties, these deficiencies. This is what I am trying to do very modestly, and trying to awaken the interest, mainly of the youth and people who think in Brazil and think the Brazilian Revolution in this sense. So this is my conclusion. On the one hand, to highlight everything that was positive in the Cuban, Russian Revolution, in the workers and popular movements in Brazil. On the other hand, to analyze coldly, theoretically, clearly, what went wrong, why didn't we advance. And we suffered the defeats and that we are living nowadays, which is a big defeat as was mentioned here. So thank you. I think this is it. It's 3:30. We have until 4. I counted 17 questions. We will have to make a selection of questions, otherwise, unfortunately, it won't be possible to answer all of them. I have 2 for Anita and 2 for the debaters. So I will start by them because you just spoke and then you can answer. So the questions, and you also can comment about theirs. Arnaldo Guedes, in your opinion, what is the origin of the theoretical fragility of the communists in the beginning period of the PCB's formation? How did PCB consider the workers' hegemony in the... What are the differences between the step-by-step and the reformism? The stage-based, so the hegemony, proletariat hegemony within the national movement. How did PCB think about? Fábio Conceição, what are if we do not consider racism as a fundamental question, what are what are the losses if we do not consider racism in the reform of the thinking towards a more communist thinking? If you could comment the influence of the Russian Revolution on the political activity of your father, Prestes, and how did PCB and PCB divide, if you could tell the history a little bit. Well, we might stay until tomorrow with this question here. So I will tweet some questions due to lack of time. I have 1.5 million identities with my comrade and friend Anita, but one divergency. PCB, I believe, was a national liberating party. Not only PCB, but the left, the Brazilian left, did not free itself from the way of the international communist. For good and evil, we are not only talking about what was bad. PCB was of highest importance since it will put the workers as protagonists of Brazilian histories, the proletariat. But now we are diagnosing the problems here. So it was a communist party, yes, although it was a national liberating party, and it put itself as a project, as an element, an organism operating in building a revolutionary process under the point of view of Marxism and Leninism. But the big problem was the fragility, the frailty PCB finds not only as an organization, but the counter-revolution in Brazil has demonstrated that it is stronger than we imagined. We underestimated the role of counter-revolution. PCB and the other left parties that arose along the 20th century, they were clandestine most of the time. But apart from PT, which was born in the 80s, was born easier than the legality of the other communist parties, which were contained until 1985. The fact of it being national liberating doesn't make it less important, since its leaders died in combat. So I wanted to really give its due importance. So apart this little divergence, I wanted to mention that the fact of the party being national liberating, it is made more severe in the second half of the 20th century. If we think that after 1945, end of Second World War, the U.S., with the money they had, a lot of money, they said, let's rebuild Europe. So in Potsdam, in 43, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, De Gaulle was just an intruder, kind of. They decided to rebuild Europe. And Stalin wanted to bite on this money. He was right. The Soviet Union was right. 20 million Soviets died in that invasion. All its industrial park was destroyed. Obviously, Stalin said, I want to rebuild Russia. But this was not the problem, but was to connect the revolutionary movement, communism, to the national project, state project of Soviet state, which meant that under the perspective of the alliance with the U.S. and the reconstruction of Europe and the money for reconstructing the Soviet Union, it suffocated the revolutionary movements. So one of the critics against Stalinism is this. I was unable to see the debate of Losurdo, but from what I read, I have an agreement with Losurdo in the sense that Stalinism is not a person, but a complex phenomenon of socialism in an underdeveloped context. All of the element of so this was what I found wrong. So the conciliation. So the communist parties became unarmed. So the agrarian reform were mandated to deliver their arms. So demobilized the army of Tito. Tito said, we took the power. And the Greeks, who are armed to deliver their arms, they said, no, we won't, and left the Greeks for their own destiny, who were massacred by the English army. So this reflected upon Brazil. So the reformism of PCB, our declaration of 1950, the socialism by Pacific paths, this is a fantasy. History is demonstrating this, that there is no Pacific way. So this declaration, which counterposes to the manifesto of 1950, which is much more realistic and much more harsh vis-à-vis the fight with capitalism. So the declaration of March is our vision, is the Brazilian version of the posture of Soviet Union as to Pacific coexistence, which leads the communist parties of the world to reformistic positions. So for a communistic party to make a revolution, they have to arrest the Central Committee to make the revolution due to Cuba. So this is a data. If you had reformism here, Also, Stalinism had a decisive role for the worldwide reformism. Well, Flavio, who spoke about the racial issue. The Communist Party is the first one of Brazilian history to put the issue, which puts the issue of the of the racial issue, so the black people. So it fights against. It fights yes, against racism. So there was an advancement, a step forward, but in Brazil. But what's important to understand that is that Marxism has demonstrated since the beginning of the Jewish issue. Marx demonstrates the following: no issue, human issue, is solved at the realm of singularity. Although the fight of the women, the black people are fundamental, they only gain dimension of concreteness if they become universal. Although you take into account the singular elements of each fight, but they only gain dimension when they become universal. So this has to be under the umbrella of the general fight for human emancipation. I will be even more brief, as usual. About the racial issue. If this has to be seen as something fundamental in the revolutionary and political fight, obviously yes. There was an understanding for several periods of the construction of these organizations, the Marxist ones. We can recall the União de Leões, Workers' Party, or EW, when Astrogildo tries a similar model here in Brazil, and that all of these organizations, they tried to not to consider the issues of racial prejudice. Some syndicates, some unions, mainly in the south of the U.S., where there is a very remarkable racism, so a very marked racism. And this is an accepted situation by some political groups. As to the Soviet Union, we can recall several names, several black militants who had a theoretical participation as activists: Otto Card, George Pedimore, Harry Haywood. Sergei Gusev will discuss the issue together with Ricardo Paredes of the Campesinato Indígena. Here in Latin America, we recall Hugo Pesce, Porto Carrera, and Mariátegui when they discuss the issue of the races in the first conference, Latin American Communist Conference. They will send the famous text there. So you recalled here in Brazil Minervino de Oliveira, who is a very emblematic figure within PCB, Marighella, and Rocildo Magalhães. He was called Lunin. He went to study in the Soviet Union as well. He was member of the Central Committee. So, no doubt, and there I will try to fit it in with to the first question about the theoretical frailty in the beginning of the party. But we can talk about a theoretical frailty in whole Latin America. In fact, those who bring something new and try to renew Marxism is Mariátegui and Julio Ortega. And still you see they are Marxist, but they have different flows. The José Martia's ideas are very present. Bolivarianism are very strong in their ideas, mixed with Marxism and Leninism. In the case of Mariátegui, we have an eclecticism, as you so-called well-seasoned. There are creative attempts in this period, despite the theoretical frailty, all the difficulties. And I believe that this attempt is stopped between around 29, when Bucharinists and Trotskyists are massively they were rechaçados, expulsos, expelled from parties, from all other political parties. Leôncio Basbal was accused of being Bucharinist, sometimes, and Trotskyist, which doesn't make sense. So others lose their positions. 1928-29, until there, it is a very rich moment of debates within the Latin American Marxism that is consolidating. But unfortunately, as of then, as Mazzeo mentions, and then putting it together with the other question, and here we join them, you have, or there is a connection, an excessive connection with the guidelines of Moscow. And as of then, all attempt of creativity, originality is gone. Because you will only make a big social change when at the same time you have the perception of the particularities of your country, of your historical process, the ethnical issue, the cultural one, the cultural differences within the international space. So there must be a relationship between particularities and universality. Lenin did that with the development of capitalism in Russia. He did that with imperialism. So you must understand this relationship. If you do not understand this, you will follow prefabricated models, and you will end up losing the track. Brazil and Latin America lives upon the monopolist capitalism. So you cannot escape this. So as of the moment you build a political construction which is revolutionary, you must bridge the theories that you receive from the Soviet Union, the theoretical production that is being elaborated, and what you know from the historical process of your own country. That's why Prado Júnior, Mariátegui are always remembered as pioneers in the attempt of an interpretation, an original interpretation, and very close to reality of the historical process of Brazil, Peru, or the Latin American reality. It is the Cuban Revolution which will disrupt this. It is very important because it will open the path with wrongdoing or not, and we can discuss this. And communists and Marxists discussed this for decades. As of the Cuban Revolution, many lost their lives, inspired by the fight of Fidel. But the Cuban Revolution opens a new perspective, different from the one that is calcified. You remember that the Soviet Union will defend the Pacific coexistence. Che defends the armed fight, create 2 or 3 or many Vietnams. So it is a totally different position. And to disrupt this political immobilism, the ideas of Guevara, the ideas of theoretics inspired by the Cuban Revolution, which came after this important moment, they will influence a whole generation. So they try as well, but they fail due to several reasons that we could be here discussing for hours. I think this is it. These issues are very complicated. Do you want me to solve everything, the problems of the world? It is very complicated. These are issues that the left is putting for itself for decades. So the racial issue is for sure embedded in the national particularities and the historical particularities in a country like Brazil or Cuba. We cannot not consider an issue like this when you are discussing a revolutionary issue. And all of this is connected to the experiences of other fights that we know from the US, Africa, with the fight for national liberation. In the whole world. So all these theoretical inflows are very important, but these issues we still need to develop further because they are very complicated. Next week we will continue at USP with this debate. Anita is the only one who won't be there. But we will be there, so this debate will continue because we need to go deeper into it. So Anita, you have the floor. The issue of the theoretical frailty of PCB has to do with the theoretical frailty of the whole country. At that time, there were no researchers about the Brazilian reality. So Marxism had no penetration at all by the time. I compared to the neighbor countries, Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile, Socialist Party, since the end of the 19th century, which despite of the reformist socialism, by all means it had an influence. Marx was known, but here and Lenin as well. But in the 1920s, here in Brazil, there was any Marxist literature in any bookstore. Those who had access to something was through copies, through foreign books, books in foreign languages. Only in 1924, the Communist Manifesto was translated. So the delay in Brazil was very big due to the 4 centuries of slavery with very strong repression, agrarian oligarchy. So differently from our Latin American neighbors, when there was the independence, it was with the prince of the royal house. It wasn't as a republic. Since in the beginning of the 19th century, Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery and to proclaim republic. So the cultural retardment here in Brazil, or delay, so they didn't have anything to to support themselves. And when you do not know the reality you want to transform, the natural consequence is imitating models. Everybody wanted to make their own Russian Revolution here. So it was a natural aspiration, and the reality was not known. So the first important writings about Brazil are from the 1930s. Sérgio Buarque de Holanda, Caio Prado. So before, it was very rare for someone to know it. The post-grade courses started only in the 1970s. Before that, the knowledge in Brazil was very precarious, and this was reflected on PCB, no doubt. The communists who tried to create the communist movement in Brazil. So the national liberating, about being national liberating. As deputies or some representatives of the militaries who were Democrats and who had contacts with the military get to know what was happening in the military, because there might be a coup d'etat to have to fight for dictatorship. And this was the fruit of the conception national liberating, which presided what the communists would do, not because they were bad, but the influence of the bourgeois ideology, the knowledge that was deficient about Marxism. It was not due to the international communists nor the Soviets. This influence had its weight, but our cultural delay, the influence of the nationalist ideas in Brazil, as I tried to underline here, you see the Brazilian intellectuals as of the First World War, they were very much taken by the nationalist propositions.
So they operated with the sectors, the more left-wing sectors, and that was PCB positioning. Most of the intellectuals came to the party in those years of 1946-47, and many remained in the party later on. So there were writers like Jorge Amado, architects like Niemeyer, and many others, Portinari. Most of the Brazilian intellectuals were part of the party because this had this national liberating perspective. They really followed the ideals of PCB. In my opinion, they were not able to turn into a party that in practice would be able to conduct the proletariat masses to a socialist revolution. It's a learning. We should study more Marxism, study the practice, and see how we can organize with that purpose in mind. About racism, both Mazzeo and Pericás talked about this. I have nothing to add. There was a question for me to talk a little bit about Prestes. Well, Prestes suffered, of course, he was influenced by the Russian Revolution. He was a small bourgeois leadership for tenantism, the largest leadership for tenantism. He had huge prestige after his column. And the surveys in the time, the newspapers in the time, everything shows that Prestes was the leader. He was the most prestigious leader in Brazil, but he was not a communist leadership. He was a leadership for the tenantist movement with liberal banners, democratic banners. That's what he was. And it was precisely the influence of the Russian Revolution that led Prestes, in face of this misfortune in Brazil because of the march of column in Brazil. He traveled 25,000 kilometers, and he was truly impressed with the misery in the countryside of Brazil. So the liberal program of the tenants with secret voting, he realized that this would not solve the problem of most of the Brazilian population because they lived under human conditions. And then he tries to find his ways. He proposes to finish the coluna to study further, to find a way. And then Astrogido Pereira comes to talk to him in Bolivia, and he takes some Marxists' books. And he was very much curious to learn about the life in Soviet Union. Astrogido had been in the Soviet Union, so he spent an entire day talking to Astrogido, asking questions about the Soviet Union. He's deeply interested. And then in 1928, he goes to Argentina. And Argentina is different from Brazil. In the bookshops, you could buy The Capital by Marx, the Lenin books, and then he reads and studies, and he becomes a new Christian, as he said himself. He's super enthused with Marxism, with a communist perspective. He gets to know about the key communist leadership in Latin America from Brazil as well. They were circulating in Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires was a center of intellectuals. And then he starts following Marxism in body and in soul, but it's a dogmatic Marxism with a great influence of Soviet Union. In 1931, he goes to Soviet Union, not as a communist. He goes as an engineer. He was hired as an engineer to work in the quinquennial plan in the Soviet Union. He studies the Marxism, and then he repeats dogmatic to dogmatic Marxism, mechanicist Marxism, and then he starts reviewing all of that. And in my book, Luiz Carlos Prestes, it is a political biography, a Brazilian communist. I show in the book that as of 1958, and mainly later in the 70s, when he goes to exile in the Soviet Union, then he has more free time, and he didn't have the conditions to study what was produced in Brazil, such as Fernandes' work and other scholars' work. So he goes back to studying Marxism. So he proposes ideas which is quite interesting, in my opinion, on how to perform the transition in the Brazilian society from capitalism into socialism. He is concerned with intermediate ways, transition ways, to be able to leap from the dictatorship that we were in. It shouldn't be simply abolishment or toppling of the dictatorship. There should be advancement towards democracy that is increasingly social, or leading us to socialism. So for those of you who are interested, my book addresses that. I mentioned the documents, the interviews that he gives, and how he develops his thinking about the Brazilian Revolution, abandoning the thesis and making really a critique for the stage-based thesis, the national liberating thesis. And he breaks with the leadership, with the PCB, because of that, because the leadership of the Communist Party that was exiled in Europe, they didn't want to do their self-criticism. They didn't want to acknowledge that it was no longer about developing capitalism in Brazil. Capitalism was developing very well, thank you very much, without needing a revolution. So Prestes decides to engage this struggle in the Central Committee, and the Central Committee doesn't accept that. That's why he has a rupture with the party. One more minute to talk about the rupturing, okay, between PCB and PCdoB. There was the 5th Congress for PCB 1960. In which there is self-analysis is done. It was approved in this Congress on the policy of the manifest from August 1950. It was a straight sectarian policy out of the reality policy. They aimed at making an armed revolution in Brazil. Well, with the national conceptions of the national liberation, it was another armed revolution, and the self-analysis is done. And of course, they want to reform. They want to migrate to the other side. And some leaders of the PCB at the time, João Amazonas, Maurício Grabois, Pedro Pomari, and some others in a small group, they do not accept to make this self-analysis. Even so, they're not expelled from the party. They just lose their positions in the Central Committee, but they receive tasks in different states of Brazil. And 2 years later, they start using this pretext, that is the shift in the name from PCB to PCdoB from PCB, that was done by the Central Committee. So there is a document, I even showed this document in my book, on the 5th Congress by PCB, giving powers to the Central Committee that was elected to, if necessary, to work for the conquering of the legality of PCB, because there was no legal record, no legal registration of the PCB. It hadn't been conquered. So if it was necessary to change the name of the party, the Central Committee had powers to do that. And then these people that created PCdoB in 1962, they start using this excuse to rupture with PCB and create PCdoB. So there is a document, the manifest. And this book, I deal with that at a certain level, mentioning documents today that are little known, but they are in the file of Unesp here in the city of São Paulo. So everything is documented. Those of you who are interested, you may consult. So the history of PCdoB with PCB is this one. And regrettably, PCdoB falsifies, twists the story, and it wants to introduce itself as if it were the party created in 1952. No, it was, a spin-off from 1962. They used this excuse because they didn't want to do the self-analysis that most of the party had done. And thank you very much. Thank you, Anita. It's 4:10. Time's up. The authors are going to be autographing their books outside. I would like to thank Boitempo and Sesc and all of you for the attention and the care for this panel. Thank you.